Good to go now. Thank you.
Is it on?
It should be, hopefully. There we go.
Wonderful. And the last items we have on there before we go to the next page is just that we'll go with you the approaches that we propose to take to review governance and finance, and get your input on that and set us up for the next couple of meetings. So if Chrissy, if you'll go to the next slide. As we get started here, just wanted to go over a little bit of virtual meeting format. I know you've been to countless numbers of virtual meetings, but we will go through this yet again, just so we make sure that we're all on the same page for teams on how to be able to show your participation and your involvement. So as Alex already said, we're recording this meeting. We respectfully ask you if you'll stay on mute during the presentation. And then as you may have a question, please just raise your hand. And really anytime during the presentation, we're comfortable with that. But we just want to make sure that that either you give us some indication that you want to ask a question and we'll call on you. The other thing, and it's wonderful, we're getting everybody joining in here, so I think we're going to have a full house. Just so that we can make sure that everybody understands how to use these tools on Teams, we wanted to see if we can utilize the reactions icons, which you'll see in the upper right-hand corner. It's a little smiley face with the hands up. If you click on that, you'll see these various icons that are underneath there. Thank you. So let's just do a test run. Here's the questions. How long have you been in Colorado? Whether it's 5 years, less than 5 years, 5 to 10, 11 to 20, clap your hands. Or if you are a native like me, raise your hand. Woohoo! Like we're high-fiving each other. All right, guys, thank you much. And you can lower your hand as well. Very good. Will, did we get you? Were you able to figure out the teams? Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to hand it off to Alex, and we will go through each one of these different sections. So you'll hear from me again. I don't know who left, but somebody must have left.
I left. I'm back. That was my phone.
Awesome. Glad to have you back. All right, Alex, let me hand it over to you.
Perfect. I'm pretty sure I know everybody on the call, but if I don't, I'm Alex Gordon. I'm a transportation planner here at the North Front Range MPO. I'm project managing the LinkNoCo premium transit analysis. Really appreciate all of your time here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we'll have. As Carla pointed out, we'll walk through a lot of the history and bring you up to where we are in the project, and then hopefully have a really good discussion and set us on a good path for bringing this to Planning Council later this year. And so with that, I think the easiest way is just to call on people and just name, organization, and yeah, let's just start with that. I will start with Becky.
Hi, Becky Carrasco with the North Front Range MPO.
Drew.
Good afternoon. I'm Drew Brooks. I'm the Director of Transport and Parking Services for the City of Fort Collins.
Aaron.
Aaron Fodge, Colorado State University.
Welcome. Heather.
Heather Paddock, CDOT Region 4 Transportation Director.
Mayor Arndt.
Jenny Arndt, Mayor of Fort Collins.
Councilmember Mello.
Yes, hi everyone. This is John Mallow, Loveland City Council, also a member of the North Front Range Metropolitan Planning Organization.
Kevin Jones.
Kevin Jones for Collins Area Chamber of Commerce, here in for our CEO, Ian Hutchison, who's out of the country right now.
Great. Mark Jackson.
Good afternoon, everybody. Mark Jackson, City of Loveland Public Works.
Liz.
Liz Neely, I am here with WSP, a part of the project consulting team.
Perfect. Carla.
Carla Pettis with HDR, going to help you lead the conversation around governance.
Chris.
Chris Proud. I am with HDR as well, transit planner, and I'm the consultant lead working with Alex.
Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Ross Amato from WSP, part of the consulting team, and I'm working with Carla on the governance piece. Nice to meet you all.
Great. Commissioner James.
Hello, colleagues. Scott James, Commissioner, Weld County.
Great. Suzette.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Suzette Millette, North Front Range MPO Executive Director.
And Will Jones.
Good afternoon, everybody. Will Jones, Deputy Public Works Director for the City of Greeley.
And Mayor Parsbeck.
Hello, everyone. Will Karspeck, Mayor of Berthoud and Chair of the North Front Range Metropolitan Planning Organization.
Great. Chrissy, I'm sorry. I think I jumped over you at the beginning.
Oh, that's totally okay. My name is Chrissy Brighton with HDR. I've been helping with public engagement on this project, and today I'm pretty much taking notes and running the slides, so I'll probably be cameras off so you don't see me biting my lip as I furiously type, but it's nice to see you all.
Great. Well, again, thank you everybody for coming. And with that, I think, did we miss anybody? I guess before we go to the next slide, has everybody introduced themselves? Awesome. Okay, so next slide. So Carla went over the agenda for today, all the things that we're going to talk about, but this is just setting the goals of what we want to get out of this. So we want to present the project and how and where we are today in that in the progress of that project. Understand how this Governance and Finance Policy Advisory Committee fits into the overall project, so that way everybody understands why we're here and what we want to get out of this group. Discussing the governance approaches. Obviously, in Colorado, there's a few choices that we could go down to do regional transit. So this is helping start that conversation. We can have all the plans in the world, but we need to figure out how do we fund that or finance that. And so that's where the funding and finance options come in. And then at the end of this process, we'll take a full suite of recommendations to the Planning Council for adoption or approval or whatever verb we decide to use at that point. And so this is talking about how do we evaluate and have that conversation to figure out what recommendation we will take to council. So next slide. Next, perfect. So this project came out of a directive from the MPO's Planning Council. We have a few plans that give context to this project, and there's also a direct set of requests from the Planning Council. So we adopted our long-range transit plan in 2018, and that had a variety of corridors connecting communities across our region. A subset of those were recommended for implementation, but there was also a recommendation in the RTE to evaluate all of the corridors that had been studied. In parallel to that, the state has been working on the Front Range Passenger Rail project for the last few years. The Planning Council said that's great to connect across the state, but we need to look at internal circulation, look within our region and getting people between Larimer and Weld counties. And then, so when we had that conversation, this idea of premium transit came up. And so we define premium transit based on our model, which considers premium transit to be anything that is above a local bus. So it is this all-encompassing term of bus rapid transit, express bus, light rail, commuter rail, It is just some kind of transit that is above something that stops every few blocks. And the other directive from Planning Council was to focus on community connections. And so the way that this project has been set up is that we are going from lines on a map connecting communities to actually looking at what that could potentially look like in the real world, but keeping in mind that the priority is connecting communities within our region. And I'd also just like to make a plug that this conversation can be really helpful for us as we work through the 10-year list of projects with CDOT Region 4. US 34 is one of the regional priorities. And so if this gives us more information to be able to share with CDOT Region 4 and what that corridor could be and look like in terms of transit, I think that's really helpful. We're also kicking off our long-range transportation plan. And so if we can have these ideas of what potential transit improvements and investments we can make over the next 25 to 30 years, that is also really helpful. So we want to take advantage and have this work done in unison with a lot of the other projects and efforts going on around the state. Next slide. And so I've touched on a few of these things, but the big thing that we want to get at the end of this project is a network of corridors that are the most promising. We'll define more what we mean by most promising later. And one of the discussions that we'll also poke at is what do we do with other corridors that haven't risen to the top? Going back to this linking regional communities, the focus is on connecting within the MPO area. And so we're not saying that connecting across the state or to communities outside of the MPO is not important, but the directive is connecting communities within our boundary. We want the recommendation at the end of the day when implemented to be easy to use, safe, and available to as many users as possible. Obviously, there's been a lot of effort related to reducing VMT, traffic congestion, improving greenhouse gas emissions. So how do we create a network that provides choice for people if they don't want to drive? And then also the recommendation that we take to you and to the Planning Council at the end of the day, we want to make sure reflects what we've heard from the public. We don't want to do this all based on my whim, surprisingly. So how do we get as many people involved in the process and hear from members of the public about their need and how they see the region growing over the next 25 years. Next slide. So building off of that, we started this project off by doing stakeholder interviews. So Chris and his team talked to a lot of local communities about how they see this project, what they see the need as. We've also taken this to the MPO's Technical Advisory Committee, and there's a little bit of overlap between the MPO's TAC and the Guidance Committee overall, but the Guidance Committee are people involved in the day-to-day transit planning, community organizations, the people that have the technical expertise. And so we've been working with them over the last few months, and we have some initial work that we are coming here for the Governance and Finance Policy Advisory Committee, where you guys are the big picture. What is the recommendation? What makes sense? What is politically palatable? And so through these four groups, we've tried to include as many people as possible and different views and try to bring up concerns during the planning process rather than waiting to the end or not including people in the process. Next slide. So this has been our process overall. I think this does a really good job of showing how people are involved and how different pieces fit together. So this first circle, the context and process, was the very beginning. We sat down, that was talking to the stakeholders in the region. Also looking at existing plans and figuring out what has been done to this point. We then moved into the transit corridor options. So that was looking at all of the RTE corridors that I mentioned before, and also what corridors were suggested by people who have participated so far. And at this point in the process where we're bringing in this Governance and Finance Policy Advisory Committee is looking at that analysis and going from lines on a map to what does this potentially look like in the real world. So level 1 analysis was looking high level. What is transit propensity? What was the draw? What are the pros and cons of each of these corridors? And level 2 will be looking much deeper. And that's where this Policy Advisory Committee comes in, is evaluating those and also figuring out how do we phase this? How do we fund this? How do we govern this? And then at the end of the day, we will have the recommendations and next steps to take to Planning Council. You'll see along the bottom the ongoing public engagement. So we had a questionnaire that Chris will talk about in a later slide. And we will also be doing 2 open houses later this year. And you'll see that throughout we have this guidance committee, which has been giving us good feedback along the way and helping guide the process. Carla or Chris, did I miss anything on the slide that you think would be good to highlight?
No, I think you hit all of the key components there, and specifically how this particular group sort of fits in, and that we've been doing a fair amount of work in advance of this so that we were well positioned to connect with all of you and give you good information going forward. So I think that's great. Thanks, Alex.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. And so in the last slide, before I hand it off to Chris to talk more in depth about what we've done so far, this is a nice graphic that shows what does premium transit mean. Obviously, is a very jargony term that means something to the MPO modeling, but it doesn't mean anything to people outside of MPO modeling. So some examples of what premium transit could mean is transit exclusivity, which is bus lanes, making sure that we're connecting regional destinations, the unique branding and identity. I think a lot of people think of MAX and think of it when they think of Fort Collins. It's looking at rail, bus, and other technologies, off-board ticketing, so that way you're not queuing at the front of a bus to buy a ticket to get on a bus. Priority signaling, so that way a bus isn't stopped at a red light or a train as well. And then obviously, I think the thing that we've heard most is connectivity and frequency. And I think it goes without saying that a transit network that's not tied into the bicycle network and the pedestrian network is not a great network. So that's just kind of the underlying process. And with that, I will hand it over to Chris to talk more about the project progress. Chris, you are muted if you are talking.
God, after all this time, I still do it. Thank you. As Alex pointed out in the graphic previously, our process graphic really and schedule, we have been doing a fair amount of work to get to a point today where we've got something some real background and understanding in the project to kick off this particular group and start moving you all forward. But what I've got are just a series of a few slides here that kind of sum up the work that we've been doing to date. And some of you we've been working with, we have a parallel team called our guidance committee that we're working with, and they're more the technical level staff. So, a lot of the leads from the transit agencies and the cities and counties, etc. So some of you on this call, some not, but we're working with that group to really evaluate and narrow the corridors to get to a set of transit corridors within the region that we think have the best possibility for success moving forward in the near term. Now, that doesn't mean that other corridors for all of the regional transit element that was completed don't have value. Those all actually start to create our overall network. I think what we're trying to do is just sift through those and surface those that might be the most promising at this moment in time. So with that said, we are taking all of the corridors from the RTE as well as some additional ones that we've identified through an evaluation and screening process. And this graphic really just lays that out. And the idea is that at the top, we're really starting at a fairly high level and at a qualitative assessment of those various corridors, and I'll show you those in a moment. And then drilling down and getting more and more detailed as we go along. So this is a traditional planning process that I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with, but our goal is, again, to get to a set of potential corridors that, again, we believe have the most promise in the near term. Next slide. So how did we really get there? And we looked at a lot of data. I included just this one slide of transit propensity because this actually layers in a lot of information into one particular slide. But there's a number of different criteria that we've been looking at across all of the corridors from the regional transit element to try and identify, again, in the near term, which perform potentially best in the time frame. Now, this transit propensity layers in a variety of elements of data from zero vehicle households, populations, disabilities, seniors, just a whole host of different things to try and get a vision for the North Front Range area of what are those sort of transit rich areas that we need to be connecting up from a regional perspective. Because if we go back to the overall purpose of this study, it really is how do we connect the communities within the North Front Range. So this isn't necessarily about connecting to Boulder or Denver or other places, even though this network could link to those and enhance transportation, across the area. But transit propensity is one of those criteria that we use to examine the different corridors themselves. So next slide. And what you see here, and some of you have seen this slide previously, but it is the map of all of the different corridors that we've been examining through our first phase or level 1 analysis. And many of these will look quite familiar to all of you that were involved in the regional transit element development. And then there are a few additional corridors that have been added here as well. But nonetheless, it gives you a sense of the breadth of different corridors that we've been examining across the entire region to try and see, again, which might kind of rise to the top from a performance perspective. But it does cover, the range of locations geographically across the city, across the Northern Front Range community. And really, I mean, clearly what we see are those major centers of Loveland and Greeley and Fort Collins, that those are really key destinations. But there's a number of other smaller and growing communities that are in between as well that have shown to be, key and important destinations to connect to as well, to and from. So next slide. One of the things that we did as we've been moving through this first level of analysis is we wanted to get some general feedback from our constituents and the residents within the region as well. So we developed a bilingual online questionnaire and went out and asked about these various corridors to see what are people thinking. Did we hit the mark? Did we have the right range of corridors that we should be examining at this level? And through from October through November, basically, of this past year, we went through and took those took the feedback basically, and heard a number of different things. But some of the key questions that we asked were, did we hit the right corridors that we are advancing? What kind of community connections might be missing from the graphics? And also, what are some of those obstacles that they see for transit usage from their own perspective? And finally, what kinds of future transit improvements would they expect to be included? And we got some really great feedback associated with the questionnaire, but there were key connections that were identified. The Fort Collins to Longmont, so that existing flex service along 287 was one that came up as key. Loveland to Greeley, potentially along US 34 is another, and Greeley to Fort Collins along the Great Western right-of-way. So that's a possible connection as well. So a few of those were some that rose to the top as far as the community's opinion is concerned. And that needs to be layered in with all of the criteria that we use to examine the corridors through our first level of evaluation.
Suzette, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So Chris, I don't know if you know this or not, but you had 148 responses to the questionnaire. Do you know geographically where those responses came from? Do you know if they were or Fort Collins or Loveland or Greeley? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, they were based in sort of those population centers. I can't say specifically if Greeley was more than Fort Collins or other areas, and we could take a little bit deeper dive into that. Chrissy actually has the hard data from it, but I don't know if it was how detailed the sort of geocoding was of that information. Some of it was we asked for zip codes, so it depends if the people responded with that level of information. Some people are okay with doing that, others not so much, so it varies. I would say though that, you know, with a regional project, 148 responses is pretty good, given that you know, this is a project that covers the entire region and may not necessarily be, you know, at the forefront of what some folks are thinking about. But what we tried to do was push the questionnaire out through organizations that we knew their groups may have some real interest in this as well. So, for what it's worth. All right, next slide. So in that first, I'm actually summing up a lot of detailed information here, and I know we're throwing a lot at you, but we have actually completed that first phase of evaluation, and we're looking to move into our what we're calling our level 2 analysis, so that we can dive into more detail in some of the corridors that have risen to the top in terms of performance. Of those corridors, the three are Loveland to Greeley along US 34, Windsor to Loveland along 34 and County Road 17, as well as Greeley to Fort Collins along that Great Western right of way. And one thing that I will point out is that while these three may have risen to the top through our level 1 evaluation, this is not sort of your traditional alternatives analysis where we're eliminating options. I mean, all of that, the corridors that I showed you from the RTE that we evaluated through level 1 have value as far as developing a transit network across the region. Regardless, what we're trying to do is sort of tease out which of those might be the first few that should move forward in the near term, and that we should start to look at from an enhanced planning process and potentially funding, et cetera, and start to work through that process. But all of the corridors have value, and the goal is to identify stages in which all of those corridors would ultimately be developed out over throughout to create a real network of transit internal to the region. So this is generally where we've landed. If we could go to the next slide. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit about before we leave this section is the next phase of work. So we've identified these three corridors. And again, we're not looking to eliminate any of those three now. What our work will be in level 2 is to evaluate them against various points of criteria and try and see if we can optimize those corridors to make them operate as best they possibly can, to really think about things like connectivity, how they might influence change in VMT. We will actually be modeling each of those corridors within the regional model to understand how they perform. We'll be looking at technology and what kind of technology might apply to some of these, whether it's bus, rail, or other means. There's lots of variation in there as well. To see what is going to function and work best along those three. We'll be looking at overall design cross sections to see what's the width of some of these designs that we're thinking about, to see are there particular areas where we have tight right of way that we might need to consider either adjusting our design or potentially needing to examine maintaining right of way for the future development of the transit corridor. Cost, multimodal access, equity from a social equity perspective for underserved communities. These are all sort of key criteria that we'll be taking into that next level and really working through these three in much more detail. So I believe if we go to the next slide, we might ping back here in a second, but yeah, I thought that was my last one. Again, I realize it's throwing a lot of information at you, but this is a lot of the work that we've been doing in advance of meeting with this group to talk in more detail about the funding and financing component and governance component. So Alex, I know you were throwing a couple notes up there. I don't know if there's a couple things you wanted to hit on before we leave this specifically as far as the previous analysis.
I don't think there's anything major. I just looked back at the results summary that Chrissy had sent, and about 75% of the surveys came from Fort Collins, Loveland, and Greeley. But we did get responses from Windsor, Berthoud, Evans, Johnstown, Wellington, Severance, LaSalle, and Timnath, as well as at least one rural Aylmer County. And the other thing is, behind the scenes, I've also thrown out the idea that the Windsor to Loveland route could have potentially different endpoints if we wanted to bring Berthoud and Severance. So I think that's one thing that we can talk about as part of the level 2 analysis is, do we have the right endpoints and things like that.
Yeah, and I think we have a real opportunity to come back to this group and share some of that information as we move forward as well. One of the key things we're working on right now for those 3 final corridors that we showed you is really working through, okay, if generally these are the corridors that work for us, now let's start to define them in more detail. Where exactly do they start and begin? So, that could be Severance, as we've talked about with corridor number 5. But finding those real termini, the corridors that they truly would follow, operationally, how frequent would they operate? And again, one of the keys here is technology. Are we talking about bus? Are we talking about bus in exclusive right of way or mixed with traffic? Are we talking about rail or other pieces? So those are pieces that we'll begin to dive into as we move forward. So I'll probably throw it back over to you, Carla. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chris and Alex. I think it's really, I appreciate you guys giving the overview and the background on this project. And really, it's a lot, I know, to take in if you're not familiar or you haven't been tracking with this. So maybe before we get too far into this next phase, are there any questions? Because we want to make sure that we've got people baselined. The intent was to try to give this group an overview of the project so that you all have a broad but general understanding of what's taken place to date in this analysis. And before we start asking you to do a little bit more work relative to the project. So I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions to either raise your hand, put something in the chat, give us some indication that either you're good to go or like I said, if you have a question, please let us know. Looks like Johnny has a question.
Hello.
Hey, Johnny.
During your guys' analysis, one of the things that I've really been, and Carla and I've talked about this, is I don't want to say reimagining transit, but it has to be looked at differently. Our days of buses and moving a bunch of people on one bus with a time and loading. But if we thought about when you guys are going through this, looking at, hey, maybe we run 14 passenger vans that run constantly every 15 minutes, so there's more flexibility, reliability, instead of looking at these differently and train and bus and all those types of things. I think we really got to think different. Uber, is there some kind of car system that could be put in that this is part of a transit thing through our communities?
Chris, I think that's you.
Yeah, I'll respond to that. So, Johnny, it's a very good point, and it's exactly where the industry is going right now, is trying to think about how can we be more flexible, more nimble, and respond, particularly in areas where the densities and the population centers are somewhat dispersed, like the North Front Range right now. So you have these fairly long corridors. Are there different ways of tackling that? Through our technology assessment, we're going to be able to look at a range of different things, whether it's some type of new mobility, the kinds of things that you're talking about, versus more traditional rail or bus or more flexible bus. There are even lots of variations on how you operate a bus or a smaller bus as well. So I think it is the range of those things that we'll be trying to give some thought to as to what makes the most sense for these different corridors. So I don't believe that we are just talking about sort of traditional transit here. We'll have an opportunity to open that discussion and kind of go beyond that as well. Alex, stop me if you think I'm kind of. Go on.
The other thing, I really want to think about public-private partnerships. One of the things that I've said very often is we're subsidizing most transit by 80–85%. So is there some way that if people are using the standard transit hubs, are they, maybe it's free? I mean, those are the types of things, I mean, because if you really want people to use it, you're going to have to change the way we're doing business. Because in today's society and the way we are, I fully believe that we've been trying to do something for 70 years or 50 years in transit, and it's really not gotten any better. So I think public-private partnerships, not taken away from the Ubers or the Lyfts, but can we partner with them that say, hey, if we get a call, we're going to pay that through our transit. If you got 2 people in it, we're going to pay for that, or something that's just not looking at transit as normal.
Gotcha. That's
And-
helpful. Go on, Carla.
And I was going to say, Johnny, these are really good comments, and they really tie into the whole governance and finance conversation. So it is good that you are part of this committee, because I think your ideas and your thoughts are exactly some of the perspective that we're hoping to add to this project. Right. So much of the analysis that's been taking place as far as really on that technical side. Now we're adding that governance and finance conversation. So thank you for those comments. And hopefully we'll hear some of how your ideas fit into the conversation we hope to have with this group. Any other questions or comments before we move on? All right, well, let's move then into your role and how you all can be helpful in this conversation. So when we looked at pulling together this governance and finance policy advisory committee, we created a new acronym, like we needed one in transportation, but we created yet a new acronym, GFPAC. So rather than writing that whole thing out, we went with hopefully something smaller. But we thought it was really important, since all of you are active within your communities, that we bring together, key policymakers. As you can see, local jurisdictions are represented here. And thank you all for making time in your schedules. We know your time is valuable. So we are wanting to make sure that we focus our conversations. We also wanted to make sure that, since we're talking about premium transit, that we're including that executive representation from each one of the existing transit providers within the region. So again, thank you all for participating. Also recognize that a large part of our users are really those academic institutions, and having connectivity between the regions oftentimes provide that access to education. So we've invited our academic institutions. CSU was able to join us. I think we have a request out to UNC, and hopefully we'll have an additional participation, as well as coordinating, if you will, and communicating with some of the community colleges. And then also wanting to have that representation from the business community, getting perspective from those large employers. So we do appreciate the fact that the Chamber is able to join us today. If you'll go to the next slide. So what is our charge? It's very simple. We really want you to help guide our conversation around the formulation of a governance plan associated with these recommendations, as well as funding and finance options that then can be formulated into a recommendation that comes forward to the North Front Range MPO Planning Council. So it's really an opportunity here for us to have some good conversation, recognizing that the decision doesn't lie with this group or even within just this particular project, but really with the Planning Council, and how can we help shape that conversation such that it is thorough and well vetted. So if you go on to the next, maybe I should ask, any comments on the charge? Or would it make more sense to talk about then what your role and responsibilities are associated with the charge? If no questions, we'll keep going. On to the next slide. So what are the expectations? Again, we recognize many of you elected officials operating at that executive level within your organizations. We're going to try to keep this conversation to 3 meetings. So hence the reason why we're going to try to cover a lot today. But we're going to try to get as much as we can out of you in the next 3 meetings to really provide that guidance. So between now and March being now, we just changed months. I'm catching up. And June, we will try to host all 3 of those meetings. All we ask of you is that you have open and honest dialogue with us, sharing your perspective and your insights. We know that each one of you come from a different perspective, so it's really valuable for us to be able to hear those perspectives. We are hopeful that you will help us look at those strategic expertise relative to the governance and the finance issues, as well as help us identify those red flags. We recognize that your perspective, as I said before, helps us really sort of get into the nuts and bolts of what it really takes for an interregional program like this to be successful. So it's really important that you share those perspectives with us. Our goal ultimately is consensus. We recognize there's going to be a lot of options for you to look at. We hope to go through good conversation about pro cons with each one of those options, but hopefully as we get to the end of this, we can say as a group, here are what we believe are your best options, or single option if we can get that far. That would be desirable. Next, we are really hoping, similar to the guidance committee, that you all can serve as community ambassadors, that you're sharing what's happening with this committee within your communities, and that you be part of that conversation so that you're bringing back perspective, again, in that broader sense. And then, as I said before, really wanting to make sure that we're in a position to be able to make recommendations to the Planning Council. So maybe we could, I think the next slide really is going to ask for your reaction. Oh, maybe not yet. I will ask for your reaction. So any thoughts on that? Does that seem reasonable in terms of expectations for your participation? Thumbs up if you're good. Let us know if you have a question.
Seems reasonable to me.
You all are an awesome group. Thank you all so much. All right. Again, we're just going to keep hammering this out until so we get to the meat of it. So, governance and finance approaches. We are a little ahead of schedule from what I had planned on. So if y'all are okay, I'm going to keep plugging forward, and maybe we can take a break if people need when we get closer to the hour mark. Would that be all right? Thank you. All right, we've got some good things showing up there in the chat as well that'll help support our conversation. So one of the things that we wanted to be able to do associated with this project is really be able to give you options. And this list of what we're talking about with you relative to these governance options are really intended to give a range of governance structures to consider that would best support this interregional mobility connectivity of premium transit, right? So this is our first, if you will, 3 options. And this is not an exhaustive definition. This is really just high level. What we're really hoping we can give to you as examples of what we have begun to see in our search through constitutional options and statutory options available to you as a region for consideration of supporting these different corridors. So the first is a metropolitan district. Some of you, I think, are very familiar with this in terms of how it's created with a petition vote of electors within that district. Centera is probably a very good close proximity example of a metropolitan district. We also found regional service authorities. This is something that is available to you, I believe, through statute. Transportation is an eligible service that is identified for a regional service authority, although we don't have any examples within the state of an RSA using this specifically for transportation, but it is certainly something that is available. Regional transportation authorities, you all are probably pretty familiar with this. Hopefully you're aware that in the Senate Bill 260 that passed last year, there was some conversation of expanding the opportunities for MPOs in the creation of RTAs. So that is one that we're proposing we look at. And I think I saw Suzette. Did you have a question on one of these three?
Yeah, I did. And maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit on this because maybe you might have something on the next slide. But if this is the list, I think we should add also what we're currently doing on our regional routes, which is just IGAs, that we just have intergovernmental agreements between the different areas. And maybe I jumped the gun on that and you have it coming up. So I apologize if I did.
Just slightly. We're on to the next page. And actually, if you can go ahead, Chrissy, and flip to the next page. We actually have 6 options for you. So the other ones are, I'll start from the bottom, that intergovernmental agreement. And as you're right, exactly, Suzette, you already are exercising some of that. And so do these corridors lend themselves to that continuation of that approach? The other one is leveraging an existing authority, right? So whether it be transport or any of these services that are currently service providers within this area, do we extend their capacity and capability? Or do you create something like a completely separate political subdivision, which is what you see with what recently happened with Front Range Passenger Rail, or RTD is another example, where you can go to the legislature and seek that specific designation. So these are really the 6 options that we were looking at. Any questions on these? I think it actually goes to my next slide. But before I do, does anybody need any clarification on the goals? I mean, I know we're booming through this stuff, so does it sound like it's the right group of the right listing, Suzette?
Yeah, so I think maybe what would be helpful if maybe you could go back through those 6 and maybe talk about sort of what it takes to do each one of those. So for example, the Metropolitan District takes a vote. The Regional Service Authority, I know like the RTA now is changed. It used to be, you know, all of the communities had to approve the RTA, and this is really saying that the voting member on the MPO has that authority. I don't know, maybe it would be helpful, Carla, if you just maybe want to touch on some of those items on each one of these. I'm just, maybe that might help a little bit.
So I'm going to try to approach it a little bit differently, if you wouldn't mind, Suzette. And Chrissy, I'm going to ask if you can go to slide, what do we have, like 28, I think is the. So what we shared with you in the previous slides were 6 different governance options that we want to be able to look at. What we want to then do with those options is evaluate each of them using this list of criteria. And I've got 2 pages of criteria. And that really gets into, I think, Suzette, some of what you were talking about. And our hope is that if you are in agreement that these are the 6 governance options, and we can add more, or we can take some of those out, and that these are the evaluation criteria, that then we would come back to you with a whole matrix filled out that answers all of these questions. And that, I think, would give you a little bit more opportunity to get into the meat of each one of those options, so that you can really see what those differences are and how they may better fit with the options that were with the corridors that are being discussed. So if I could walk through these criteria, maybe that's where the question really comes into play. Are these all the right questions that you want to have answered?
Yeah, Carly, you had somebody else had their hand raised. I didn't know who that was.
I didn't see who that was either.
That was me, Johnny.
Hey, Johnny.
One of the things that I'm going to make a statement on is probably not going to surprise anybody in the room. But working towards a big governance structure with elected officials and moving to, especially with the funding criteria coming from communities, I think that's going to be a hard sell for us. It's going to have to be something. I mean, some of those are very more government approach kind of things, Carla, and those probably won't go well in our community. So just making that statement, I'm not saying not to keep them on the thing, but big metro districts, big regional governance, transportation districts. I'd have to see the RTA to see what that is, according to what Suzette, but some of those big government structures are not what I don't think our community would be interested in.
Well, maybe I've got about, I don't know, 10 or 12 criteria here. Maybe we can walk through these, Johnny, and see if it addresses what you're talking about, and perhaps we add something more that talks to the simplest administrative approach or least administrative burden to creation or to structure. If I'm understanding what you're suggesting in terms of not wanting to create more government.
That's fine. That sounds good.
Okay. All right. So here are the criteria that we wanted to propose. As we look at each one of those 6 structures that I identified before, do these structures grant sufficient legal authority to construct, operate, and maintain a bus or a regional rail, right? And I know that that's kind of a narrow definition, Johnny, given some of what you were talking about before, but maybe we can modify this to say to support premium transit. If Chrissy, as you're taking notes, you can note that for me. The second one is evaluating each one of these to see how the body is governed, right? So what is the governing approach to oversight on each one of these structures? Question on whether or not a vote is required to put any of these governance structures into formation. That would be, is it a vote of the MPO? Is it a vote of the public? Is it a vote of only the jurisdictions? Those kinds of things. We'll want to evaluate them for what type of transit system this actually supports. Are we talking about a single line or multiple corridors or a regional system? Some of these structures are limiting in that way. Another one, or the next one, would be, does this governance structure allow for the preservation of right-of-way? We recognize there's a tremendous amount of development going on within the North Front Range area, and so do any of these governance options support that objective? We'll want to look at how this governance structure interacts with existing transit services. And I think that speaks somewhat to what you were talking about, Suzette, in terms of leveraging existing services. That might be part of that conversation. Chrissy, if you can go to the next. We want to look at these structures to see if they enable geographic equity. That we know that since these are corridors that are looking at how to connect the region, are we providing that equity? Would these structures come with dedicated revenue sources? And this is really speaking to by statute or by constitution, or their revenue sources that are specifically identified for use by that governance structure. The next one would be, would this governance structure enable eligibility to pursue and accept state and federal funding? I think that speaks to our connection to the funding and finance options. And are we able to maximize our full range of potential funding sources? Does this entity have bonding authority and the ability to issue debt? Depending on what we're talking about in terms of the level of investment that may need to be made, having that authority both for bonding and debt issuance, I think may be important. Whether or not you choose to exercise it in the future is unknown, but having it up front is much easier rather than adding it on the back end. And then lastly, as Johnny had indicated before, are there, can this new governance structure or whatever entity is created have the ability to utilize alternative delivery methods like P3s, design, build, and construction contract. I'm going to get it wrong. Heather, help me out. Contract management, general
contractor. Construction management, general
construction
contractor.
manager, general contractor.
You got
I
it.
should have just said CMGC and waited to see if anybody asked the question. So that's about, I think that's 11 criteria. And our hope is, as I said, or I shouldn't say our hope, our intent is to really take those 6 structures and evaluate them based on these 11 criteria or others if you think there's something else that we're missing here. And really try to pull this into a matrix that then we can get into more of the meat of what the pros and cons of each approach might be. So I think this is the next slide. Suzette? Did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Sorry, I was just taking a minute to find my mute button there. So when you're talking about these different structures, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding this on the timeline we're talking about, are we talking about what can be implemented like in the next 5 years or out to the timeline of the plan, which is the current one is 2045. So I'm just trying to get a sense of what we think is possible near term as opposed to long term. Are we trying to figure both of those things out, or are we just focusing on more the near term?
You know what, we did not actually think of that in that context. That might be a really good evaluation criteria to add on, knowing near term and long term, or the longevity, right? Ease of creation and maybe longevity to serve the region.
Carla, I may just add on that a little bit, because I do think that, you know, clearly for the corridors that we're trying to advance right now, or, you know, we'll be working through the level 2 analysis at least, we do need some kind of structure that could do that. And these could be different things. You know, maybe there is something different in the near term, continuing to use the MOAs or other mechanisms to advance some of these corridors. But I do think we need some recommendations on both, because it's really about ultimately realizing that full network, as opposed to just the core corridors that you know, may rise to the top for evaluation here too. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easy thing is to keep doing what we've been doing, right? That's the IGAs. So I mean, that you could do in sort of the near term, because we've already started that on a lot of the corridors. And some of the more the more things that take votes and political will and things like that are definitely not going to happen quickly. That's I guess why I was asking the question.
Yeah, fair point. Thank you.
And I think, Suzette, maybe just to continue with that thought a little further, there is nothing to say that this group can't offer a strategy, not just options. Right? So if the strategy is that you think this is what should be done in the near term, and maybe this is something to consider for the longer term, that I think would also be very helpful and appropriate for this study. Heather, did you have a question?
I did, and I guess I'm not remembering all of the criteria because I don't have the slides in front of me, but was there anything around, and maybe I missed this, but how are the other transit providers integrating into this new structure? And what's the thought? And I guess, should there be a question around, I guess my concern is a little similar on the front of what Johnny was saying, but I'm just trying to think, like, how do we, you know, formulating a new like RTA makes me nervous. Like, we should be leveraging the skill set and knowledge of the existing successful transit service providers out there and figure out how to tie the systems together. Or were we thinking this would be an umbrella over all of those? And it's that governing body that's going to sort of dictate how these tie together? I'm a little, I might have just lost track here.
Nope, nope. I think these are all really good questions. So Chrissy, if you'll go back to the first page of criteria. We do have something there. We do have an element in here that talks about how would a governance structure interact with existing services. Okay. We can also rephrase that to say interact with existing service providers, right? And be specific in terms of the organizational relationship as opposed to just the service relationship. So I think that would be an easy either add-on or modification to that criteria. So that would be my thought on your first question. On the second one, and based on something that perhaps Suzette and Johnny were saying as well, it sounds like there's a desire for a type of efficiency, perhaps, criteria. I don't know that I can come up with the language specifically off the top of my head on how to phrase that, but something to that effect on how efficient can we be with connecting within the region, making those connections within the region. Does that sound about right, Heather?
Yeah.
Is the right word?
Yes.
Okay. Commissioner James.
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to do what I uniquely do and throw a skunk out in the middle of the room and see if anybody tells me it stinks. We went from a LinkNoCo study, from a premium transit study that was talking about identifying corridors and seeing if maybe we could throw down some lane miles and move people around better, to governance structures and legal authorities and taxation and public indebtedness. How did we get here? How are we not only talking about how we create the supply, how we govern the supply, how we indebt the public to provide the supply without first even analyzing the demand? I guess I would like to see that demand study before we even have a conversation about monster massive governance. You've got a group of people in Weld County and in Greeley who have, via the will of the state legislature, been drawn into a front range rail district. I just have a feeling that's going to go to a vote, and I have a feeling the people in the Denver Boulder areas are going to speak to the people in Greeley that may not even see that railway in their county. We need to be sensitive about the taxation burdens that we're putting on people. Have we even analyzed the demand or the will of the people to want this kind of thing? I mean, I'm all for having the conversations, but boy, we leapt from let's have a conversation about how we more efficiently move people around northern Colorado to let's set up a governance structure and to go into debt. How did we get from A to Z? I'm just curious.
No, it's a great question, and I think it really does speak to, and I think Chris and Alex in the beginning were really trying to give you that background in terms of the analysis, the technical analysis that's taking place. That really does begin to speak to what's the demand, what would potential ridership be, what problems are we actually trying to solve, right? As well as trying to identify what opportunities connecting the region through premium transit actually provides to the region, what that benefit is. And then it is a little bit of an additional piece then to say what we want in your conversation is to say, how would we then deliver something like that, right? And the governance options that we presented to you here are really, if there is a determination that a new governance option is needed versus continuing to do things through IGA. That's why IGA is one of your options. And the second part of the conversation, which we haven't gotten to yet, so I'll just mention it and then let Chris add on. Mm-hmm. But we also want to be able to look at different funding options and what's available to you. It may be that as you look at those funding options, you may not think that you need a difference in governance structure, right? But what we don't want to do is put you in a place to say, hey, we're looking at this interregional connectivity, and we don't really have a mechanism that is robust enough to handle that type of improvement, right? So it's really, that's why I said it's really a range of options that can be very, very simple to something that can be very complex. Or and can the region grow with whatever option you choose? And that kind of speaks to the strategy we talked about before. But Chris, maybe you can give Commissioner James a little bit more conversation on the technical aspects of this review.
Well, there are a couple things there, and first, nothing stinks at this point, I would say, and I appreciate the comment actually, because this is the forum where we can, put those, there may be differences of opinion around the table, and that's fine, but this is exactly the forum where we're supposed to be putting those things forward and talking about, tough issues. So as Carla kind of framed up, we are, making our way through this evaluation process, really building on the regional transit element. So there's a fair amount of history of planning and public engagement that has gotten us really to this point. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need to keep checking in, talking with the public, understanding what those priorities are and the direction that we should be going. And I think, as Carla pointed out as well, is creating a overarching governance structure is not necessarily a foregone conclusion. It just depends. That's part of the conversation that we're starting to have here as a group, which is why we have decision makers like all of you as a part of this team to kind of help move the project in the right direction. We do know through past planning, again, that's gotten us to this point, that there is interest from the local communities and local stakeholders in making these kind of connections. And then the question is, okay, so how do we define what these connections are, what kind of bus, what kind of service, et cetera, and then how do we pay for them? And really what we're doing right now is just putting all the options on the table and seeing ultimately through an evaluation process what potentially makes the most sense to try and advance some of these, while checking in with the public on a regular basis to make sure that from their perspective that we're going in the right direction as well. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit at least.
It does. Surveys are always kind of an interesting thing to me. I wonder how many folks were asked, when they talked about building light rail in downtown Denver, when RTD went out and did those surveys, would you utilize, and do you think this is a good idea? I think people feel fabulous about light rail as they drive through it on I-25 in their vehicles. They drive right by it. I think, look at that RTA. I feel good about Denver because it has a light rail, but they're not going to get on the darn thing. These surveys that sometimes we throw out in these worlds, and Alex, I love you, brother. I'm not taking a shot at your survey, but I think we need to be a bit more scientific before we start talking about spending millions of dollars in truly getting into the psyche of an individual who might actually utilize this. I, as a Weld County Commissioner, say, geez, I would love to have light rail in the mix in my community. I would love to have a more robust transportation system. It makes me feel good about Weld County. But can I pay for it, and will people use it? And those are the true in-depth studies that we need to have.
Yeah. Good points, and I appreciate the feedback.
And I think they're all very valid comments, and those are, the way of truth testing, if you will, the conversation and the analysis that we're going through here, right? So any of this process, and will include an evaluation of demand, of potential ridership. Sometimes that's even criteria to be eligible for funding, right? So it's not as if this conversation needs to be about what just feels good, but it really has to coincide with what is actually needed and in demand. The other part of what I also want to make sure that that we're very cognizant of is, one of your former colleagues was very clear in terms of being able to talk about what are we doing within the region in order to be able to support the growth and the movement of people within our region, right? As opposed to up and down, from Denver to Fort Collins, right? Or movement in or out of the region. What are we doing to support movement within the region? And so
I think guess her name. I think I've guessed her name. And yes, I would agree with my former colleague in the fact that it is an inter and an intra-regional conversation that needs to be had.
Yeah. Heather?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you saying that we are going to continue to look into the demand. You know, I guess I'm gonna jump on Johnny's thought process here of, you know, really thinking a little bit more innovative and outside the box. I guess I would ask technically, you know, transit works in very dense populated cities, right? Take New York, take Chicago, Boston. We are not them, right? Maybe in 100 years, maybe we'll get there, but we don't have that level of density at the moment. So what is the best way to move those people? And what mechanism, you know, to connect the communities is best? And maybe it isn't a typical bus or train car or light rail. You know, I did listen to a presentation one time from Boston, and they have a program called Bridge, but it's not spelt like bridge. But it's almost like the ride share that Uber offers now, but it's pretty, and basically they guarantee you don't have to walk more than like less than a mile from where you're getting picked up and less than a mile to where your destination is, but they combine all these trips. They do it in a small van. You know, when I think about sort of the more rural nature of Northern Colorado and the various destinations people want to get to, you know, like myself, I want to go to Old Town. How long is it gonna, you know, how easy is it for me to get to from my suburban sort of little pocket in Fort Collins to downtown Greeley for a concert? And something like some different types of ways to move people in mass quantities, but not in, you know, full buses of 30 people on a set line, I think should be considered.
Carla, can I just to interject for a second, because I do think that it's a very good point. And, you know, looking at innovative ways of moving people throughout the region and what that demand is, and trying to align the kind of service that we provide with the demand that we have. I do think that we have some good examples of transit that functions well in rural areas, whether it's Bustang, whether it's Flex or others. Now, granted, they're connecting sort of different kinds of origins and destinations, but that is something that we can learn from. But really, part of this next phase of evaluation that we'll go into is, again, looking at the different service options that we have and trying to model those out for the demand that may exist for those, because we certainly don't want to take forward options that are not going to be successful. I mean, that really is our overall goal, is to optimize these so that they are going to be potentially the most successful transit options that work in the context of Northern Colorado, because it's not Denver, it's not even Colorado Springs or places like that. You know, we have our own unique needs within the North Front Range that we're going to have to be able to respond to appropriately. So, and I think Suzette had a hand up as well.
Yeah, thanks. So, you know, I think this conversation is, a lot of the concerns I'm hearing from people almost sound like it's a second level where we're actually looking at the demand analysis. And I think we do need to pay attention to that. You know, the things that are going through my head is like, yes, transit is most successful in dense urban areas, but it's also very successful going into Aspen when not, because people that work in Aspen can't afford to live there. So they have this huge demand on their transit system. So there are cases like that. And so I'm thinking, and Carla and Chris, tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking that that next stage where we actually start looking at the demand on whatever line takes us goes to the top, when we actually start digging into that, that's when we'll start looking at demographics and certain things like that, and the viability of actually providing that service. Am I close on that?
You're on the absolute right track there, Suzette, and a lot of the basic demographics, again, we're getting more and more detailed as we go along in the process. A lot of the basic demographics that transit propensity that I presented early on tries to get at that demand and that need along the different corridors, at least at the early screening stage. But now that we're going to be moving into the next screening stage, we will actually be looking at much more detailed what truly are the future anticipated employment numbers, population numbers, and then all of the other layers of socioeconomic data that we would include in the regional model. and layer in these transit lines and say, okay, if they were to operate on X frequencies with different types of vehicles or other elements that may influence that model, we'll include all of those assumptions to try and determine what do we think that true demand is in a scientific manner. So I'll leave it at that.
I want to try to see if or make sure that we provide opportunity for others to make comments, and maybe I can just call, you know, on a few of you that we haven't heard from, and if you would like to say something, please do, or give us a thumbs up if you think this is going in the right direction. But Mayor Karspek, any thoughts or reactions?
I think it's just a good conversation. I kind of feel myself in a little of all of this. Overall, I'm excited. I appreciated Councilmember Olson's points. I think Commissioner James had a really good one. Are we getting off track in the first place? But so I'm just kind of listening along.
Great. Mayor Arden, anything?
Yeah, I'm also just listening. I think there's, you know, we've been trying to set up something on regional water as well, and we have a strikingly similar conversations, especially around governance and structures and input. And so transportation is sort of new to me. So I am making analogies to some things I know more about and being very interested in. So I'm right here.
Wonderful. Councilman Mello?
Yeah, I find the conversation very interesting. When you start thinking outside of the box, you come across some obstacles. It's never easy. So it's good to identify all the obstacles now versus later. So I really enjoy the conversation.
Good. How about a couple of the others? Drew, any thoughts? Anything? I know you've got some stuff going on as well. So in this conversation around
No, just enjoying the conversation and really hearing a lot of different perspectives. So a lot to take in. Thank you.
Will, anything from you?
Same thing. Lots of good conversation, and I think it's important to evaluate all alternatives and look at those impacts. So,
Mark, anything? Any suggestions for anything we should be doing differently or adding on?
You know, I think that if we were listening carefully, I think the elected officials gave you a very good flavor of kind of where the political winds are blowing, and that's some of that's history. There's a lot of history in Northern Colorado about some of these efforts that have tried and not been quite so successful. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that, and we're wise to pay attention. The second is, you know, there's a lot of comments about we're not Denver, we're not this, we're not that. I guess my 2 cents worth is don't be looking at this in a 2022 with a 2022 set of lenses. Be thinking about what Northern Colorado looks like in 10, 15, 25 years. And I think the dynamic changes. I think it expands what your universe of alternatives could be.
Very good. Thank you. Aaron, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Mark just made a really astute point. I think, you know, the idea of having the chance to identify a strategic right of way for transit is huge. Of course, we had the benefit recently, right, of having existing right of way to expand I-25, and took advantage of that through IGA and agreements between the entities here in Northern Colorado. So certainly we've shown that we can do this and collaborate. I can't speak to the, you know, what's been done regionally in terms of surveying our populace about demand for transit. I can only speak to, you know, what we see currently here at the university and here in Fort Collins. And I mean, we have commuters come in regionally every day, so by transit. So hopefully through this effort, we'll help allay any concerns that nobody wants to ride transit with better surveying. So happy to be a part of this group, and Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Aaron. Kevin, any thoughts that we should be taking into consideration from a business perspective?
As always, I'm looking at this with respect to how it supports workforce, how it enables growing the economy, and how it improves quality of life. So, that's as I listen, those are the lenses I'm looking at. It's good to hear Mark Jackson, talk about the lens of looking towards the future, because I've wondered that myself sitting here listening is, where should I, be looking to down the road in terms of, timeline. So I like that Mark said, don't judge too quickly on we're not Denver, we're not, a larger, denser area. So that was helpful to me.
Very good. Becky, any thoughts for us before we move to the next section?
Sorry, I also struggled with unmuting. No, I don't have any.
Wonderful. Well, Chrissy, if you can actually go to, I think, slide 31 for us. And just to reiterate that as we look at these, that one, thank you, next steps. So specifically associated with governance, as I said before, our thought is to try to look at these 6 options. And again, if there's any of those that you don't think are worth our reviewing right now, we are happy to take any of them off. Or if you'd like to see the full range, so that as we're having the conversation going forward, you can say, we looked at all these different things and this is why we came to our conclusion, right? Or we see how different options fit as we go forward. Then what we hope to do is take these criteria. We talked about a couple of more here that perhaps we could add on relative to efficiencies and looking at those that perhaps provide near-term opportunity or long-term opportunity. But our hope at the next meeting will be to come back to you with this filled out. And it will not be something that you will have to read during the meeting. We will put this together, send it to you in advance, give you the opportunity to digest it, and then come to the meeting with some reactions and some feedback. And hopefully we can continue the great conversation that we've had today into the next phase of the conversation around governance. So if there aren't any more questions, I'll give you one last chance to see if you've got a question before we move into the funding and finance. Okay, if not, Liz, you're up.
Thanks, Carla. So as I mentioned, my name is Liz Neely, and I'm here to lead the funding and financing options analysis. And first, I'm going to kind of go over our approach and methodology to help you better understand how we are going about this. I will say that a lot of this is very dependent on the transit corridor selected, so the 3 that we've identified, and then also very much dependent on the governance and what is ultimately selected. As Carla mentioned, there are several things to consider, like is there debt capacity based on which, what the analysis leads to and which governance option is selected. So I just want to keep that in mind. We are going to dig deep into this, but we're not there yet because a lot of things depend on it. So to start with, we are conducting a high-level review of all the funding options out there, including options that are now available through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BIL, and we're conducting our research in 3 phases that are listed here. Essentially, we're outlining our funding options. We're researching each of these, and then we are organizing what we find in a user-friendly format, which is actually going to be designed in a matrix. And I will talk about that actually on the next slide. So this slide here and everything in blue outlines really what we're trying to dig into with each of the funding options. This is what we've identified with the project team along with Alex, and where what we feel are the best ways to evaluate each of the funding options. We're looking for you to chime in here to see if you have anything that we're missing, if we have too much we're evaluating. Obviously, the more we look at, the more complex our evaluation becomes. But we want to make sure that we're honing in and understanding exactly what we need to look at. The idea around this matrix is that it's dynamic. The reason for that is because right now we have 3 transit corridors that have been selected through level 2. And there are obviously different funding options that could be applied to each one independently. We want to be able to give the user a chance to say, okay, I want to filter this based on the project that I'm looking to fund, or even the project phase that I'm looking to fund. And so that you can essentially go into this Excel document and filter based on exactly what you're looking for. Ultimately, then you'll come up with the options available. And then that really kind of narrows down your search. So as I mentioned earlier, when we jumped into this slide, everything in blue essentially is a column. And then we add in each of the funding option in the rows, and then we provide all the detail within. I just saw a comment come through about P3s. P3s are great. It's something we want to narrow down on once we have a better idea of the corridor, and it might be an evaluation based on each, but we can't provide like an overarching, well, we can provide a very high level overarching P3 way to fund the project, but to get into the weeds of it, we would want to look at it corridor by corridor. And so right now, what I'm showing you is the traditional funding options and what will be included in the matrix. And then when we put together a memo with Carla and the governance pieces, we'll tie in a little bit more specifics to the corridors. I saw a hand go up.
Yeah, that'd be me.
Commissioner James, yes. Sorry.
There's a curiosity that I have, and the funding is obviously tied to the roadway and to the ownership of the roadway. And is this a federal highway? Is this a CDOT piece of roadway? Weld County has proven, would like to prove again, that we could very efficiently build a roadway that moves people. I give you our hallowed County Road 49, but that is an example of a project that can be built without some of the onerous ties sometimes that belong to our kind friends at the Colorado Department of Transportation. When we take a look at building these corridors, I look at, say, a County Road 74 into Harmony Road kind of a corridor. I take a look at a Freedom Parkway, a County Road 54 into a County Road 18 corridor. Those kind of corridors can be just as vital to the region without some of the onerous hoops that we have to jump through, if the road is state or federal based. And so perhaps the funding becomes an easier lift depending on the corridor that we look at. Just a thought and a comment.
Yeah, no, I'm writing that note down. Thank you. I think that yes, there are a lot of different elements to the funding options you can use, including ownership, that has to be incorporated and considered. Any questions or comments on the list of evaluation criteria? Anything we're missing? Suzette.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess maybe this is just in the state piece, but we've got these enterprises now through Senate Bill 260, and I'm just wondering if maybe we should add some of those enterprises, especially for us in the non-attainment enterprise, that perhaps we should add maybe that enterprise as a funding source.
Yes, and so this will include, the examples under funding sources, you're seeing the federal side, but it will include the state and local side. And so, we will certainly be looking at, like you said, SB 260 and any other state or local options. So thank you for pointing that out.
What's your next slide?
I think, Carla, these are the option. The next slide, if they want to see a visualization of how it's set up with the columns and the rows, we can take a look at that. But it's just more to understand what you're going to look at when it comes to the dynamic matrix.
Yeah, so with this, if you don't mind, Liz, I think part of what we're going to try to do, and mind you, we have 2 more sessions with you after this. So our intent is to look at, again, those governance options, be able to look at those the funding and finance options, and see where we can maybe marry some of these up, right? I mean, that would be the ultimate and the most efficient offering we could provide, so we can try to see if that is possible as we go through this conversation. But as I shouldn't say but, in addition, as I'm looking to some of the comments in the chat, a large part of what we're also hoping to glean from our conversations with you, and really in the advice that you can and perspectives that you can provide, is the understanding of the other things that are going on within the region or within the MPO, and those conversations, and how this effort fits with those conversations, right? Or doesn't, because that's an important part of our development of recommendations that then can actually be helpful, useful to the MPO, right? The intent is to take this conversation in the end to the Planning Council for further conversation. And so to the extent that we can work our way through not just what this study is looking at, but knowing the context or the universe in which we're operating, I think will be important to be able to have as a perspective in this discussion as well. Is that?
Yeah, thanks, Carla. I raised my hand and lowered it because you said what I was going to say, which is tying the governance structure to the funding options, because obviously those two things are going to get tied together at some point. But the other thing I was thinking about is, as you were talking about some of these the financing and funding structures on this, is that I'm also wondering if well, I guess I'm wondering if we had the ability to use these corridors and tie them. Do you think you could do a matrix that would tie the funding to the funding financing options to the governance structures? Is that a possibility to tie those two together?
We talked about this.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great question, and I think at this stage we're so high level that I don't think we're there yet. The one piece here is the eligible applicants, which is listed as one of the criteria we'll evaluate. I think that's certainly going to help us determine how it fits in with the governance side of it. I do, Suzette, want to find a way to make sure that we incorporate the two together. I just think as we continue to meet with you all and further this project, that we'll have a better understanding of how we can actually pull them together.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is what might be helpful is also maybe I'm just thinking of sort of a level of difficulty. So, if you go after state Senate Bill 260 money and you're doing IGAs, that's pretty easy. I mean, that's something that, we're doing now. The money's out there. But if you're talking about, you need to develop a whole new funding structure with a whole new board, and you need to get something passed on a ballot initiative, that's way more difficult. And so maybe having something like that. And again, getting back to my timing question, or as you said, Carla, strategy is like, what do we do now and what do we do into the future? What's that potential into the future? So that level would also be helpful, because I'm just guessing, I don't think we would in 2022, if we want to start something in 2023, we might take the easier low hanging fruit to start with, and then move into, as it's more proven, move into something more complex.
So you're all very strategic thinkers, and there's nothing that precludes us in this to limit the conversation to just, if you will, governance and finance, without having that then strategy or recommended strategy to be able to advance to the region, right? Because that's the conversation ultimately I believe your colleagues on the planning council are going to want to have anyway, right? They're going to want to be able to not just know about what it is that is being proposed here relative to premium transit, but where does it fit into the larger context of what the region is really trying to do and what the MPO has the ability to advance.
Yes, I agree.
Any other questions? Any thoughts, reactions? I mean, you know, do you feel like, I mean, we have like about 20 more minutes here. And, you know, before we get into recapping, is there any other things that have come to your mind as we've gone through this conversation, or give us a thumbs up if you think we're heading the right direction? Is that?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in, and I guess when just listening to the conversation, I think there is some anxiety over the funding, not the funding option, but the governance options. And I really think that the funding and the governance are tied together. And I just want to, you know, again, this is all MPO council driven, and jumping from where we are now into something really complicated is going to take a lot of time. If that is the desire of the council, then we will move in that direction. But remember that just because we're exploring these options doesn't mean we're necessarily going to take those options. We just want to know what the universe looks like. So I just want to say to people that are concerned about, we're just going to jump into an RTA or we're just going to jump into a metro district or something like that. That is not necessarily the case. We just want to open up the universe of options.
And Suzette, I'll just hop in right there. I appreciate that very much. And I think we should weigh all those options. But at the same time, I guess the reason that you put schmoes like me who want a popularity contest on these calls sometimes is that we run I want a popularity contest for a reason. That's kind of understanding what my constituency wants. And I got to tell you, for the Weld County constituency to place another tax upon itself, that is, you have to have a very high deliverable there. And so while I appreciate the options, I don't want you guys expending a whole bunch of staff time chasing after the crossbreeding of a unicorn, because it just ain't going to happen. You know what I'm saying? Let's try to be realistic in the bar that we set.
And if I could, I do believe that the options that Liz has identified here really do give you that range of how do you access and leverage existing dollars. It's not just about how do you raise taxes, right? I mean, I think it really is important for us to, and given that, you know, we have the passage of the recent legislations, and I'm going to include both of them, both what happened at the state level as well as what happened at the federal level, we really should be exploring what are those options available to us now. And how can we be creative on match in pursuit of grants? How can we look at perhaps reprioritizing funds if this is the goal and the direction that you want to go? I mean, all of that is part of the conversation that we think is essential to have your input on. This is not just, hey, we want to go find a way to create, we'll say it, an RTA and a tax. That's not what this is about. Or that's not the, you know, the intent here.
So Carla, maybe if I could, because I'm just hearing a lot of concern about all the different governance. So maybe if we could go back to that list and
sure,
and just ask people if are there things on that list that you think we should not even consider.
Well, I'm anxious to hear what you discover on all of them, but RTA are 3 letters that mean so much. And I think that is a high bar. Again, you have to have a robust deliverable, a big promise, and then deliver on the big promise to get our taxpayers to consider that. Suzette, you were a part of that fun little exercise in the beginning too, weren't you?
Well, you know, I didn't actually work on it, but yes, I was at the MPO when they did 2 of them. So yeah, we took 2 shots at it. The second one, you know, got further along than the first one. But yeah, and I would say with the new legislation, it changes that dynamic a little bit on how it works. But honestly, it changes it in the legislation. I don't think it's really going to change much in practicality how it would work. I can't imagine, Commissioner James, that you would come to the MPO and place a vote, a yes or no vote, without having the backing of your board. And I think that would be the case for any of our elected officials.
Yeah,
so
sure.
in practicality, I think it doesn't really change much.
And Suzette, I should have studied better. I remember that piece in Senate Bill 260. Does it allow the governing body of the MPO to make that decision? It does not have to go to a vote of the people. Please remind me.
Yeah, and I may not have all of this, but it is the vote of the MPO. So for example, the MPO council can vote to say, yes, we want to form an RTA. Now remember, the RTA is split into two pieces. It's forming the board, and then it's going after the tax. So the MPO can say, yeah, we want to form the board, if you will, around the RTA, and then go in, we working towards that taxation, or whatever that would look like. So
But
that's
to actually levy the tax, that still is, it's a Tabor thing. That still has to be a vote of the people, correct?
It is.
Yeah, it is. And I think the tricky part for the MPO is that we have never been a taxing authority. We have no regulatory authority. And so that would hugely change the dynamic for us.
And just to maybe add a little bit more clarification before we get to your question, Heather, none of these options eliminate the Tabor requirement to take a vote, to take any taxation vote to the vote of the people, right? So that is just a given, and we need to appreciate that and recognize the importance of that. And well, maybe I'll just stop there and then let Heather make a comment, and then I have a suggestion.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say I appreciate, I'm supportive of this approach. I appreciate the matrix. And I think one thing that maybe would be helpful when talking about funding is, what is available to us today in the size of dollars, not just what types of programs, but in the size of dollar amounts. One of the largest challenges with transit is the operations and maintenance. And, the dollars available to us may end up driving the type of authority we end up needing. Because if we've got a robust plan, a good, you guys are going to do all the data analytics for supporting transit, but what's that cost to operate and maintain? If the pool of opportunity is really small, that may end up driving the authority and the direction we go. But without knowing that, without aligning the two, and sometimes I feel like we don't talk enough about what it costs to operate and maintain. And it's not that it's outrageous, it's that the amount of dollars available to spend for operations and maintenance makes it really hard to accomplish the goals of the operations and maintenance that we want. So putting some real tangible dollars, recognizing it can all change tomorrow, but let's talk at least in today's dollars and what kind of buckets are available. And they're becoming more available, right? 260 is allowing a lot more flexibility for transit operations. And I would think the bill, IIJA maybe does too, but I don't know.
Very good points. Mayor?
Me, Jenny?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was thinking, thanks, okay. I was thinking about that. And I'm super naive, because I know these things are expensive, but would we have to go to the people for a tax? I mean, as far as I can see, sorry to say, but I mean, there's a lot of money coming down. I can see a regional authority, but we have the MPO, and maybe we need something else, that I don't, maybe an RTA fits it better. But the question is going to be, how do we absorb all that money and where do we spend it and how do we put it? I don't think it's the immediate question of how do we raise more. I mean, I think we're getting more general fund, we're getting more transportation is. That's just a thought that crossed my mind. And even if we had the authority to go to the people to ask, I don't know if we immediately would even do that. I don't know. So, and I also kind of like some of Johnny's earlier comments about, I really think, and they kind of dovetail with some of Scott's, you know, I always think that there's a cultural aspect here to transit, and maybe our culture's changing enough that we can support large transit networks. Heretofore, Westerners have been pretty independent. So back to Scott's comments, like we love it, the transit when we drive by in our cars. We are very individualistic people. And I was wondering, back to Johnny's comment, maybe we reimagine how this looks in terms of the technology coming on board, smart cars, self-driving. I always just imagine super naively like a virtual train of cars that are self-drive. I own a self-drive car. It works. That, you know, are either Uber or public-private or private or I don't know, public, I don't know, but they can peel off at a more individualistic destination and sort of onboarding process. Now, I'm just talking futurism stuff, but some of this stuff takes so long to build. By the time we build it, it will be yestertech, you know. Anyway, it's important to match the dollars to our culture, I think, unless we foresee a rapid change in our culture. I haven't seen that. But I do think technology can help us reconceptualize transit to fit the needs within our cultural, how we are. I don't know if that whole mess made any sense at all.
It actually did. I appreciate the comments. Very, very insightful.
No, I don't know that.
Heather, did you have another comment?
No, I probably forgot to take down my hand. Sorry, I'll work on it.
I just want to make a plug that if you think it would be helpful for me to go to the county commissioners or city council or town councils and talk about this project and have this discussion, please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to go wherever and talk to whoever about it. Just to, I've said this and I mean it, that if there are concerns about this project, I want to know during the planning process. It would break my heart to take this to council and then council asks, what is this? Why is this? And not be able to give them an answer of how we got here. So I just want to make that plug that I'm more than happy to go on a traveling roadshow to talk about this project.
Thanks, Alex. Will, did you have a?
Yeah, just a thought, and I, you know, to kind of tie in some different comments, Mark's, you know, thinking 20 years out, and I, you know, looking at an RTA right now, it kind of makes my heart stop a little bit just because of some of everything that we're talking about. Are we going to, and so where I'm kind of going with this, it feels like we're trying to think 20 years out, but is some of this process going to be, or more, some of this process kind of outlining what that roadmap is to that ultimate, or am I looking at this wrong? Because it seems like if we're trying to flip the switch to go to an RTA or whatever it is, you know, in a couple of years, it's a big jump. And so is it possible, or is part of the outcome from this going to be not only what the ultimate could be down the road and what the best solution is, but what is the roadmap to get to that point, or what's going to be needed to get there? I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
It does, and maybe I can make a suggestion. Although I see there's a lot of comments. Let's keep going with the comments, and I'll make my suggestion at the end. Suzette?
Yeah, and I think, Will, your comments are spot on. I think what I'm hearing a lot of people, it's the RTA that's giving people a lot of heartburn on this list. Because we've been down that road twice. It was a very painful road to go down. And there's a lot of concerns about that one. So I just want to reiterate that it doesn't mean we're going to go into an RTA because we're looking at this. I mean, honestly, I think short term, we'll probably just continue with the IGAs in the shorter term. And then, as we've talked about, have a strategy for moving into something different. It doesn't have to be an RTA. It could be something totally different. So just because RTA is on the list, please don't think that means that's our ultimate and where we're heading. If you want to see the RTA removed from the list, if that's the will of this group and we don't want to look at that, I mean, we can have that removed from the list if that's the will of this group.
Let me suggest something. Were there other comments, or am I missing anybody? Does anybody have their hand up that I can't see? One of the things that we talked about in preparing for this presentation today was to try to decide if we should lead in this presentation with governance going first and then funding going second. And because you really can go either way, and it does set a tone. And clearly, governance is not the first conversation that you want to have. I think I hear that from the comments that are being made. So what I would suggest is that perhaps what we do in our analysis going forward is that we really lead with what it would cost and what are the potential revenue streams that are available to us in order to be able to support the corridors that are being promoted up through this process. If, as we look at those corridors going through that are being proposed, that those revenue structures or the entities that are currently being considered do not have the ability to, if you will, stretch the full length of that boundary in order to be able to deliver that service, or that an IGA for whatever reason might not work, I don't know. But that we really focus in on the funding as the lead in this conversation, and that we look at governance as a supportive structure as it may be necessary to be able to look at the delivery of those corridors. Does that feel more comfortable to this group?
Yes, to me.
You give me the either yes or thumbs up or use your little icon.
This is Will. It works for me too.
And that way, I think it gives you more space to say, hey, we've got legislation that's passed recently. There's a couple of different revenue streams we want to look at, but perhaps we're not covering everything, to Heather's point, because we may create a system that we don't necessarily have the full O&M to be able to support, and then what would we do to be able to find that? Or to Johnny's point, maybe there's a P3 or another approach that we can use in order to be able to try to deliver these. Good. Is that feeling better? What I would offer you, and I know Chris, you want to say something, so I'll call on you in just a second. One of the things though that I want to be make sure that we don't underserve you in that conversation is that as you get people who say, or you have constituents or people within your communities or your councils or whatever that say, hey, why are we just doing an RTA? Why don't we create I don't know, one of these other options that you say, you know what, we've looked at that, and this is the pros and these are the cons, and how it contributes to your overall strategy in the consideration that you've given to all your options. So I don't want to cut you short in that conversation either. I want to empower you to have an understanding of what these options are, and you may choose to reject 5 of them once you've seen the information. Is that still valuable to you? I'm not looking for more work. Please understand me. It takes an effort to fill out that chart, so I want to make sure that you still want us to do that. Okay. Chris.
So Carla, I just want to build a little bit, and I appreciate how you sort of brought this back around once we kind of heard what the concerns were, and hopefully it demonstrates to the group here that, you know, we're looking to you all to help us shape what this is as well. I mean, you are the, you know, local decision makers for your communities and your constituents. So we appreciate that, and Carla, I appreciate the way you kind of brought it back around for us. I do want to, you know, I was thinking a little bit more on the innovations that were mentioned in the beginning, and kind of making sure that we're thinking out of the box about, you know, what kind of service might be supplied here, and then maybe, you know, require a particular governance structure, particular funding, et cetera. And as I thought about that more, I just want to make sure also that you're taking credit for the good work that you've done. I mean, you have some strong transit ridership locally, whether it's GET or Colt or Transford. You've also been, you know, doing a lot of things that are quite innovative, particularly for a very rapidly growing yet an area that has lots of rural segments associated with it. You were ahead of the curve, or at least Transport was on BRT, particularly in the state. Even Denver doesn't have actual BRT, and Transport has been building a network of that for quite some time now. And I just want to make sure that we are understanding that there is already a good basis for transit usage in the North Front Range, and to some extent, it is somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's if we're able to provide service that really works well for people, that is something that they will make that choice to use as well. I mean, there are certain portions of the population that simply can't use transit because they, require a truck for work or whatever that might be. And we recognize that it varies as to who is able to use transit. But nonetheless, I just wanted to point out that you've got some really good transit service that's provided locally in the area, and then building on top of that with Bustang and others to connect to other parts of the state. Take credit for your successes to date, and hopefully we can build on that here. So I'll leave it at that, Carla.
Okay, so we are nearing the end of our discussion here. We only have a few more minutes left. I do want to just go around really quick, see, does anybody, one last opportunity, does anybody want to make any comments, or are you feeling good that with sort of reordering this approach, it'll meet your needs? Okay, are those, Kevin, did you have a comment? You're on mute.
Yeah, just a question, and based on some of the questions I've heard, Commissioner James, talking about kind of scientific study of demand. I may have missed something in the pre-meeting materials, but is there a set of scientifically within reason derived assumptions that all of this is based in? I'm assuming there is, that we're working with a set of assumptions about population forecasts, future demand. Does that exist and I just haven't seen it, or does that not matter because other groups are working on that?
Yeah, and I think what we can do, Kevin, in order to be able to help support that and that we can bring this meeting to an efficient close without having to go into a lot more conversation, we're going to send me a recording of this or a meeting notes to everybody so that they have an opportunity to see that. We'll send you the link to the project website so that you have a chance to peruse through that a little bit more in a little bit more detail and at your leisure. And then we will continue to share, I guess you can say, the information as we're going along in this process. And as well as, and I think Aaron has, Alex has offered this a couple of different times, we are more than willing to sit down and have individual conversations if it's helpful to give background or to give a specific update on where the project is at. We're more than willing to do that. Before we adjourn, again, there are going to be 2 more meetings. We're thinking that the next meeting, and Chrissy, if you can go to the very last slide, we want to do those, schedule that meeting in the next 6 to 8 weeks. So we'll go back, now that we've gotten some really good direction from you, do our analysis, come back to you. We are going to do a doodle poll to see if we can find the right time. I know that Commissioner Stevens wasn't able to join us today, so apparently Wednesday afternoons on the first Wednesday of the month is not good for her. And we do want to make sure that we get as many people as possible. But we will doodle poll you and try to get another time on your calendar. But I so appreciate all the comments and suggestions and your participation in this meeting. I think that's it. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.